They say it only takes one night to change your life forever. I used to think that was just a dramatic saying, the kind of thing you'd hear in a movie or read in a book. But now I know it's true. Because one night, one stupid, reckless, drunken night, was all it took to destroy everything I'd spent years building. It started innocently enough. The office was buzzing in the days leading up to the annual New Year's Eve party. Every year, our company rented out a fancy venue, complete with a DJ, catered food, and an open bar. "It's going to be the party of the year," my coworker Allison said as we stood by the coffee machine. "Are you coming?" "I don't know," I admitted, glancing at the calendar on my phone. "It's a busy time with the kids. Plus, Dan and I were thinking about having a quiet night at home." "Oh, come on," Allison said, rolling her eyes. "You work hard all year. You deserve one night to let loose. Bring Dan along, it'll be fun." That night, I mentioned the party to my husband, Dan. "Do you want to go?" I asked, trying to gauge his reaction. Dan frowned, his expression skeptical. "I don't know, Sarah. Those work parties can get pretty wild. Do we really want to spend New Year's Eve with a bunch of drunk colleagues?" I laughed, brushing off his concerns. "It's just a party, Dan. Besides, we haven't been out in forever. It could be fun." Dan hesitated but eventually agreed. "Okay," he said. "But let's not stay too late. The kids will be up early, and I don't want to start the new year exhausted." "Deal," I said, kissing his cheek. The night of the party, I felt a strange mix of excitement and nerves as I got ready. I wasn't the type to go out often. Most of my time was spent juggling work, kids, and the endless demands of everyday life. But as I slipped into a sleek black dress and applied a bit of makeup, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of anticipation. When we arrived at the venue, the energy was electric. The room was packed with coworkers and their plus ones, everyone dressed to the nines and ready to celebrate. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and for the first time in months, I felt like more than just a mom or an employee. I felt free. The first few hours were uneventful. Dan and I mingled, made small talk, and shared a few laughs. But as the night went on, the drinks started to pile up. "Come dance with us," Allison said, grabbing my hand and pulling me onto the dance floor. I hesitated, glancing at Dan, but he waved me off with a smile. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll grab another drink and wait here." The music was loud, the lights were bright, and before I knew it, I was laughing and dancing with my coworkers, the weight of responsibility melting away with every beat of the music. That's when things started to spiral. At some point, someone handed me another drink. Then another. And another. The details of the night became a blur, a kaleidoscope of laughter, music, and poor decisions. I remember dancing with one of my colleagues, Mike, who'd always been a little too friendly. I remember his hand on my waist, his breath warm against my ear as he leaned in to whisper something I couldn't quite hear over the music. And then, I remember kissing him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't premeditated. But in that moment, with the alcohol clouding my judgment and the adrenaline of the night coursing through my veins, I made a choice I would regret for the rest of my life. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a sinking feeling in my stomach. Dan and I had left the party early. He'd noticed I was getting too drunk and insisted we go home. "Sarah, you were out of control last night," he'd said as we climbed into the cab. "What were you thinking?" "I was just having fun," I'd slurred, waving off his concerns. But now, in the harsh light of day, I couldn't brush it off. The memories of the night before came flooding back in disjointed fragments, and with them came the crushing weight of guilt. I thought I could keep it a secret, that what happened at the party would stay at the party. But secrets have a way of coming out, and mine wasn't an exception. A week later, Dan came home from work, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "Do you have something you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice tight. My heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I got a call from Allison," he said, his voice trembling. "She said she saw you and Mike at the party. She said," he paused, his voice breaking. "She said you kissed him." In that moment, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "Dan, I can explain," I stammered, tears streaming down my face. "It was a mistake. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking. That's your excuse? Dan snapped, his voice filled with anger and hurt. You weren't thinking? You're a wife, Sarah. You're a mother. How could you do this to us? I'm sorry, I sobbed. I'm so sorry, Dan. Please, I'll do anything to make it right. But Dan just shook his head, his expression cold and distant. I don't think you can, he said quietly. That night, Dan slept on the couch. And the next morning, he told me he wanted a divorce. The word divorce hung in the air between us, sharp and cold, like a knife I'd never seen coming. Dan, please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. But Dan's expression didn't waver. I can't trust you anymore, Sarah, he said, his voice heavy with sadness. And without trust, there's nothing left. Over the next few days, the reality of my actions began to sink in. Dan moved into the guest room, avoiding me except for short, strained conversations about the kids. The house felt emptier than it had any right to. It wasn't just Dan's absence, it was the weight of what I'd done, the knowledge that I'd brought this on myself. Our children, Emma and Jake, were too young to understand what was happening, but they could sense the tension. Why is Daddy sleeping in the other room? Emma asked one night as I tucked her into bed. I forced a smile, my heart breaking. Daddy just needs some quiet time, sweetheart, I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her innocent eyes searched mine, as if she knew I wasn't telling her the whole truth. Are you and Daddy mad at each other? No, baby, I whispered, tears welling up. We're just working through some things. Work became both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gave me something to focus on, a way to escape the suffocating silence of my home life. On the other hand, it was a constant reminder of what had happened. Mike avoided me completely, which was both a relief and a source of anxiety. I knew he was just as guilty as I was, but I couldn't help resenting him for being part of the mess I'd made. Allison, who'd been the one to tell Dan about the kiss, confronted me in the break room one afternoon. You didn't leave me much of a choice, Sarah, she said, crossing her arms. Dan deserved to know. I know, I said quietly, unable to meet her gaze. I wish you'd talk to me first. Allison sighed, her expression softening. You're my friend, Sarah. But so is Dan. And I couldn't keep something like that from him. Her words stung, but I knew she was right. One evening, as I sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine, Dan walked in and placed a stack of papers on the counter. What's this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Divorce papers, he said, his voice steady but cold. I've already filled out my part. You just need to sign. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. Dan, please, I whispered. Don't do this. Think about the kids. Think about us. I am thinking about the kids, he said, his voice cracking. And they deserve better than this. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of that fateful night at the party. Why hadn't I stopped myself? Why had I let things go so far? The answers didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. In the days that followed, I threw myself into damage control, desperate to salvage what little was left of my marriage. I called therapists, booked counseling sessions, and begged Dan to come with me. He agreed to one session, but it was clear from the start that his mind was already made up. I'm here for the kids, he said bluntly when the therapist asked why he'd come. But I don't think there's anything left to save. His words cut deeper than I thought possible, but I couldn't argue with him. As the weeks passed, the divorce became less of an abstract concept and more of a reality. Dan started looking for apartments, and we began discussing custody arrangements. Every conversation was a painful reminder of what I'd lost, not just my husband, but the life we'd built together. One evening, as I packed up some of Dan's belongings, I found an old photo album tucked away in the back of the closet. Flipping through the pages, I saw snapshots of our life together, our wedding day, the birth of our children, family vacations filled with laughter and love. Tears blurred my vision as I realized just how much I'd taken for granted. By the time Dan officially moved out, the house felt unbearably quiet. Emma and Jake took turns asking when he'd be back, and each time, I struggled to find the right words. Daddy still loves you, I told them over and over. And he always will. But deep down, I knew they were asking a question I couldn't answer. Will we ever be a family again? The first night without Dan was the hardest. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where he used to sit, and felt the weight of my actions crush me. I'd lost my husband. I'd broken my family. And all because of one stupid, drunken mistake. The days after Dan moved out were a blur of routine and heartache. I tried to focus on Emma and Jake, giving them as much stability as I could, but the emptiness in our home was impossible to ignore. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of him, the chair at the kitchen table where he used to sit, the way his laughter used to fill the room, even the faint scent of his cologne lingering on the throw pillows. I kept telling myself I needed to be strong for the kids, but most nights, after they were asleep, I'd sit in the dark and cry until there was nothing left. At work, I did my best to maintain a sense of normalcy, but everyone knew. The office grapevine worked faster than I could have imagined, and whispers followed me everywhere I went. She's the one who kissed Mike at the New Year's party, right? Her husband left her, can you blame him? I wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't know the whole story. But deep down, I knew the details didn't matter. I'd made a mistake, a terrible, life-altering mistake, and now I was living with the consequences. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, Mike stopped by. Hey, he said awkwardly, hovering near the edge of my workspace. Can we talk? I didn't look up. What is there to talk about? I feel terrible about everything, he said. If I could go back and change it, I would. Yeah, well, it's a little late for that, isn't it? I snapped, finally meeting his gaze. Mike's face fell. I'm sorry, Sarah. For everything. I wanted to tell him that sorry wasn't enough, that his apologies wouldn't bring my husband back or undo the damage we'd caused. But instead, I just nodded, my throat tight with emotion. The kids struggled to adjust to the new normal. Jake, my youngest, was too little to fully understand what was happening. When's Daddy coming home? He'd ask every night at bedtime, his big blue eyes filled with confusion. Emma, on the other hand, was old enough to sense that something was wrong. She started acting out at school, picking fights with her friends and refusing to do her homework. Mom, why did Daddy leave? She asked one evening as I tucked her in. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. How could I explain something so complicated to an 8-year-old? Sometimes grown-ups have problems they don't know how to fix, I said carefully. But that doesn't mean Daddy doesn't love you. He loves you very much. Do you still love Daddy? She asked, her voice small. Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. I do, I said softly. Very much. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of the mess I'd made of my life. I don't even know who I am anymore, I admitted during one of our sessions. I used to think I was a good wife, a good mom. But now, I don't know. You're still those things, Sarah, the therapist said gently. You made a mistake, a big one, but that doesn't erase the person you are. Her words gave me a flicker of hope, but it was hard to believe them when I felt like I'd failed so completely. Dan and I only spoke when we had to, mostly about the kids or logistics. Our conversations were short and formal, a far cry from the easy, affectionate banter we used to share. One evening, as he dropped the kids off after spending the weekend with him, I tried to break through the wall between us. Dan, can we talk? I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, then sighed. About what? About us, I said. About everything. There's nothing to talk about, Sarah, he said, his tone cold. You made your choice. Now we're dealing with the consequences. But I didn't choose this, I said, tears streaming down my face. I didn't choose to lose you. No, he said quietly. You chose to betray me. And this is what that looks like. His words echoed in my mind long after he left, a painful reminder of just how deeply I'd hurt him. I wanted to believe there was still a chance to fix things, to undo the damage I'd caused. But every time I reached out, Dan pushed me further away. One day, as I sat in the car waiting to pick up Emma from school, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling at the beach, celebrating birthdays, cuddling on the couch with the kids. Each picture felt like a knife to the heart, a reminder of what I'd lost and how far we'd fallen. I wanted to go back, to rewind time and make different choices. But life didn't work that way. All I could do now was try to pick up the pieces. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I couldn't change the past, but I could try to build a better future for myself, for my kids, and maybe, just maybe, for Dan too. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But I owed it to myself and to the people I loved to try. The first step in rebuilding my life was admitting I couldn't do it alone. Therapy became my safe space, a place where I could untangle the web of guilt, shame, and regret that had consumed me since the night of the party. "Why do you think you acted the way you did?" my therapist, Dr. Monroe, asked one session. "I don't know," I said, wringing my hands. "I guess. I felt stuck. Like I wasn't enough, not at work, not at home, not as a wife or a mom. And the alcohol?" she pressed gently. "It made me feel free," I admitted. Like, for one night, I could forget everything and just be. Dr. Monroe nodded thoughtfully. "And now I feel like I ruined everything," I said, tears welling up. "I don't know how to fix it." "Fixing it starts with forgiving yourself," she said. "You can't move forward if you're still carrying the weight of the past." Forgiving myself was easier said than done. I'd spent so long replaying that night in my head, berating myself for every poor decision, every boundary I'd crossed. Letting go of that guilt felt impossible. But I knew I had to try. I started making changes in my everyday life, small steps toward becoming the person I wanted to be. I cut back on drinking, limiting myself to 1 glass of wine on rare occasions. I began journaling each morning, writing down my thoughts and feelings as a way to process everything I was going through. I also started spending more quality time with Emma and Jake. We baked cookies, played board games, and had movie nights in the living room. Those moments with them reminded me of what really mattered, of the love I still had in my life, even if it looked different now. One afternoon, as I picked Emma up from school, her teacher pulled me aside. "I just wanted to let you know that Emma's been doing much better lately," she said. "Whatever changes you've made at home, they're working." Hearing those words felt like a small victory, a sign that, even in the midst of all this chaos, I was doing something right. Dan and I remained distant, only interacting when it came to the kids. But as the weeks turned into months, the tension between us began to ease. One evening, as he dropped Emma and Jake off after their weekend with him, he lingered in the doorway for a moment. "How are you doing?" he asked, his tone softer than it had been in weeks. "I'm trying," I said honestly. "One day at a time." Dan nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's good," he said. "I'm glad." It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. The turning point came during Emma's school play. She'd been cast as a sunflower in her class's production of The Seasons of Spring, and both Dan and I showed up to cheer her on. Sitting side by side in the crowded auditorium, we exchanged polite small talk as we waited for the show to start. It was the first time in months we'd been in the same space without the weight of anger and resentment hanging over us. When Emma's turn came, she beamed as she delivered her one line, and Dan and I both erupted into applause. "She's amazing," I said, unable to hide my pride. "She really is," Dan agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, it felt like old times. After the play, as we stood in the parking lot saying our goodbyes, Dan surprised me by saying, "Maybe we should grab coffee sometime to talk." My heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. When we met a few days later, the conversation was cautious but honest. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Dan said, stirring his coffee absently. "About us, about the kids, about what went wrong." "Me too," I said, my throat tight. "And I know I'm the one who broke things, Dan. I take full responsibility for that." "It wasn't just you," he said after a moment. "I mean, yes, what you did hurt me. But I wasn't exactly the perfect husband, either." I think we both stopped trying long before that night. His words hit me hard, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time, it felt like we were both acknowledging the cracks that had been there all along. We agreed to keep talking, to figure out how to co-parent effectively and maybe, one day, rebuild some kind of friendship. It wasn't the reconciliation I'd dreamed of, but it was a step forward, a chance to find peace, even if it wasn't the ending I'd hoped for. That night, as I tucked Emma and Jake into bed, I felt a flicker of hope. Our family might look different now, but we were still a family. And as long as I kept showing up, kept trying, there was a chance to make things better. The coffee meetings with Dan became a weekly ritual. At first, they were strictly about logistics, coordinating schedules for the kids, discussing school events, and sorting out finances. But over time, they started to feel easier. We began to talk about other things, work, mutual friends, even our memories of the early days of our relationship. It wasn't quite friendship, but it wasn't hostility either. It was something in between, something fragile but comforting. One afternoon, as we sat at a small cafe near the kids' school, Dan surprised me by asking, "Do you ever think about what it would take to fix things?" His question caught me off guard. Fix things between us? He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not saying we should. I'm just wondering if you've thought about it." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think about it all the time," I admitted. "But I don't know if it's possible." Dan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me neither." After that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about his question. Could we fix things? And even if we could, should we? Part of me wanted to believe it was possible, that the love we'd once shared was still there, buried beneath the hurt and anger. But another part of me wondered if too much damage had been done, if some things were better left in the past. In therapy, I brought up Dan's question, hoping for clarity. "What do you think about the idea of reconciliation?" I asked Dr. Monroe. She tilted her head, considering my words. "What do you think about it?" she countered. "I don't know," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. Part of me wants it more than anything. But another part of me is terrified. What if we try and it doesn't work? What if we hurt each other all over again? Dr. Monroe nodded. "Those are valid fears," she said. "But the fact that you're asking these questions shows that you're willing to do the work. Rebuilding trust is a long, difficult process, but it's not impossible." Her words gave me hope, but they also made me realize something important. If Dan and I were going to try again, it couldn't just be about me making amends. It had to be about both of us choosing to move forward together. A few weeks later, as Dan and I sat at our usual cafe, I decided to bring up the topic. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my heart pounding. "Of course," he said, setting down his coffee. "Do you think there's any chance for us?" I asked, my voice trembling. Dan was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I think maybe it's worth finding out." We agreed to take things slow, to focus on rebuilding trust before making any big decisions. It wasn't a promise to get back together, it was a promise to try, to see if there was still something worth saving. The first step was opening up about everything, our fears, our doubts, the things we'd both kept bottled up for too long. I felt invisible, I admitted one evening as we sat in the living room after the kids had gone to bed. "Not because of you, but because of me." I didn't know how to ask for what I needed, so I just stopped trying. Dan nodded, his expression pained. "And I stopped paying attention," he said. "I was so focused on work, on the kids, that I didn't notice you slipping away." It was a raw, painful conversation, but it was also necessary. For the first time, we weren't just blaming each other or ourselves, we were acknowledging the ways we'd both contributed to the breakdown of our marriage. We started spending more time together, not as a couple, but as co-parents trying to rebuild a sense of partnership. We took the kids to the park, attended Emma's soccer games, and worked together on school projects. Each shared moment felt like another step towards something new, something fragile but hopeful. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, Dan turned to me and said, "You've changed, Sarah. Is that a good thing?" I asked, smiling nervously. "It is," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I like who you're becoming." His words made my chest tighten, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, not just for us, but for myself. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about the life we'd built together, the good, the bad, and everything in between. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But maybe that was okay. Because sometimes, the most beautiful things are born from the hardest moments. Rebuilding a relationship is like piecing together a shattered vase. Even if you manage to put it back together, the cracks are always there, a reminder of what broke it in the first place. Dan and I were still figuring out if we could live with those cracks, or if we even wanted to try. We continued spending more time together, but it was always cautious, careful. Neither of us wanted to rush into something we weren't ready for, especially with the kids caught in the middle. One afternoon, as we sat in the park watching Emma and Jake play, Dan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think they know?" he asked quietly. "Know what?" "That we're trying," he said, gesturing between us. I sighed, watching the kids laugh as they chased each other around the playground. "I think they sense something's different," I said. "But I don't think they understand what it means yet." Dan nodded, his gaze distant. "I just don't want to give them false hope," he said. "Not unless we're sure." "Me neither," I said softly. That conversation stayed with me, a reminder of just how high the stakes were. This wasn't just about me and Dan, it was about the family we'd built, the life we'd shared, the promises we'd made to Emma and Jake. If we were going to try again, we couldn't afford to fail. A few weeks later, Dan suggested we start therapy together. "I think it could help us figure out what we want," he said. "Whether it's to move forward together or not." I hesitated, the idea of opening up in front of a therapist making me nervous. But I knew he was right. If we were going to have any chance at reconciliation, we needed help. Our first session was awkward, filled with long silences and tentative words. But as the weeks went on, we started to open up. I felt betrayed, Dan admitted one session, his voice heavy with emotion. "Not just because of what you did, but because I thought we were stronger than that. I thought we were better." "I thought so too," I said, tears streaming down my face. "And I hate that I let you down, Dan. I hate that I let all of us down." The therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Patel, encouraged us to focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. "What can you do now to rebuild trust?" she asked us one evening. "Be honest," I said immediately. "Even when it's hard." Dan nodded. "And be patient," he added. "This isn't something we can rush." Patience became the cornerstone of our journey. Some days were good, filled with laughter and shared moments that felt almost normal. Other days were hard, weighed down by doubts and the lingering pain of what had happened. But through it all, we kept trying. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Dan turned to me and said, "Do you think we'll ever get back to what we had?" I thought about his question for a long moment before answering. "I don't think we can go back," I said honestly. "But maybe we can build something new, something better." Dan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like that," he said. As the weeks turned into months, I started to notice small changes in our dynamic. Dan wasn't as guarded as he used to be, and I found myself feeling more comfortable being vulnerable with him. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, he laughed at something I said, a genuine, unguarded laugh that made my heart ache with both joy and longing. "What's so funny?" I asked, smiling. "Nothing," he said, still chuckling. "I just realized how much I missed this us." His words made my chest tighten, and I had to fight back tears. "Me too," I said softly. The turning point came during a family camping trip. It was Dan's idea, a chance for the four of us to spend time together away from the distractions of everyday life. As we sat around the campfire that first night, Emma and Jake roasting marshmallows and giggling over ghost stories, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "Thank you for this," I whispered to Dan as the kids ran off to chase fireflies. He smiled, his eyes warm. "It's nice, isn't it?" "It's perfect," I said, my voice trembling. That trip reminded me of everything I loved about Dan, his kindness, his humor, his unwavering love for our kids. It also reminded me of why I was fighting so hard to make things work. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we were a family. By the time we returned home, it felt like we'd turned a corner. Dan and I still had work to do, but for the first time, it felt like we were truly on the same page, partners in every sense of the word. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a real chance at making this work. The camping trip marked the start of something new. It wasn't a complete reset. Dan and I still carried the weight of everything we'd been through, but it was a chance to rebuild, brick by brick, the foundation of our relationship. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. We continued therapy, both individually and as a couple, and the sessions became less about rehashing the past and more about planning for the future. What does a healthy relationship look like for the two of you? Dr. Patel asked during one session. Trust, Dan said immediately. Communication, I added. And effort, he said, glancing at me with a small smile. It has to be something we work on every day. I nodded, my heart swelling. Every single day. Our kids noticed the changes, too. Emma stopped acting out at school, and Jake's bedtime questions about when Daddy was coming home grew less frequent. One evening, as we sat down for dinner together, Emma looked up from her plate and said, "It's nice having you both here." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I reached for Dan's hand under the table. "It's nice being here," I said, smiling at her. Dan and I began finding joy in the little things again, cooking together, taking the kids to the park, even just sitting on the couch watching a movie after the kids went to bed. Each shared moment felt like a small victory, a reminder of why we were doing this. One evening, as we walked through the neighborhood after dinner, Dan stopped and turned to me. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious but calm. "About what?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "About us," he said. "And about how far we've come." I nodded, my chest tightening. "We've come a long way," I said softly. "I think." "I want to try again," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want to come home, Sarah. For good." Tears filled my eyes as I reached for his hand. "I want that too," I said, my voice breaking. Dan moved back in a few weeks later. It wasn't the seamless transition I'd imagined. There were still moments of tension, still days when the past felt closer than it should have. But we faced those moments together, reminding each other of how far we'd come and why we were still fighting for this. On our anniversary, Dan surprised me with a small gathering at home, just the two of us and the kids. As we sat in the backyard under the glow of string lights, Emma and Jake presented us with handmade cards that read, "Happy Anniversary, Mommy and Daddy. We love you." Looking at their smiling faces, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for them, for Dan, and for the second chance we'd been given. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Dan and I sat on the porch, sipping wine and watching the stars. "I'm proud of us," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Me too," I said, leaning into him. We sat in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke again. "I don't know what the future holds," he said. "But I do know this: I love you, Sarah. And I'm glad we didn't give up." Tears filled my eyes as I reached for his hand. "I love you too, Dan," I said. "And I'm so thankful you gave us another chance." The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were walking it together. Our marriage wasn't perfect. No marriage ever is, but it was real, and it was ours. And that was enough. A year later, Dan and I renewed our vows in a small ceremony with just the kids and a few close friends. As we stood under a canopy of blooming flowers, holding hands and promising to keep choosing each other every day, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. We'd been through the fire, and we'd come out stronger, not in spite of our struggles, but because of them. And as I looked at Dan, at Emma and Jake, at the life we'd rebuilt together, I knew one thing for certain. This was our second chance. And we weren't going to waste it.